Welcome to TSAT. Today I am going to discuss a topic in environment regarding ecological succession. So in this context, in this topic known as ecological succession, as you know now what environment is. In environment you have got diversified flora and fauna. The existing diversified flora and fauna right now in the environment have not been created as it is. The existing biodiversity, both in terms of flora and fauna, are the resultant of ecological succession. Ecological succession is a process where, stage by stage, living organisms in the process of evolution convert from simple organisms to very complex organisms. In this process of establishing themselves in the environment, there has been certain kind of stages in this process of establishment of the species themselves in the environment. In this process, you have got a primary stages and final climax stages. So the first living organisms which have established themselves in an environment where there is no pre-existing life is known as pioneer species. So after being establishing themselves, they increase in number, reproduce, establish themselves. In this process, over a period of time, they change from simple to complex over a period of stages. And what happens is there will be a final establishment of species. The existing species right now, which we are able to observe them, are known as climax species. So this happens through certain stages. What are they? Let us examine, understanding what ecological succession is. So in this context, what is succession? Succession is the series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time. So what happens is a community is a group of species living in an environment interacting together. So a series of predictable changes happening in the biodiversity. Succession helps an ecosystem to recover and return to a state of equilibrium after a fire or volcanic eruption, flood, or some other disasters or disturbances. This is known as, the second one is known as secondary succession. When the existing ecosystem is being destructed, what happens is again some species try to establish there in the destructed place, and again the succession happens, which is known as secondary succession. The difference between primary succession and secondary succession is, in the case of primary succession, there is no pre-existing life forms. In the case of secondary succession, happens when the existing ecosystems or habitats are being destructed. There are pre-existing life forms, but they have been destructed because of certain calamities, might be caused by nature or man-made. So in the case of ecological succession, natural gradual change in the type of species that live in an area happens. So what happens is, in the process of conversion of this stage in the ecological succession, what happens is there will be a gradual change in the species. So for example, when the life has been originated on the earth, it is not this kind of life where you have got complex biodiversity right now, which has got very simple life forms. In the initial stages, they are unicellular microscopic organisms. Later, gradually, they have been converted into algae, grass, etc. In the same way, in the case of animals, protozoans, poriferans kind of organisms have established, which are very simple relatively compared. So there is a gradual change in the type of species, and in this process of change, which are simple, the species have been converted from one group of organisms to another group of organisms. Species are a group of organisms which are capable of interbreeding. If they are not able to interbreed, they doesn't belong to the species. This is one of the basic criteria need to be satisfied to call a group of organisms as a species. So there is a gradual change in the type of species, because in the process of adaptation, one species transforms into another species. So there will be a change in the species composition in an environment in the process of succession. in the process of converting from pioneer species to the climax species, from simple to complex. Can be primary or secondary. Just now we have discussed the succession can be primary succession and secondary succession. The gradual replacement of one plant community by another through natural process over time. So this consumes time here in the sense millions of years. So ecological succession is the sequential process of rebuilding an ecosystem when a disaster destroys it, in the case of a secondary succession. There is primary and secondary ecological succession as we have discussed. See this in the picture being depicted to you. So annual plants, which are very simple, means annual plants means where the whole life itself is being limited to 1 year. After 1 year they die. So gradually it converts into shrubs and gradually into thorn or deciduous forest, into woody, long, thick stem vegetation can be observed over a period of time gradually. This is a gradual succession from a simple to a complex stages of biotic aspects in terms of flora and fauna. In the initial stages, in the primary succession, there is no pre-existing life forms, exposed bedrock. Later, the simple kind of living beings in terms of lichens, moss, grass develops here, kind of algae. Next, annual weeds, which can live for about a year. Next, perennial weeds, which can live for a longer duration, shrubs. So gradually, what happens is the large big trees, the angiosperms, which can live for a longer duration, can be observed in this process of succession from pioneer species to climax species. So in this ecological succession being explained to you, you might have an idea that climax species means they doesn't change or they are going to be established forever, but it is not fact. The aspect is, when you relatively compare with our lifespan, there seems to be establishing in an equilibrium without any kind of change. But because the succession is a continuous process, because evolution and adaptation is a continuous process, in this succession, a combination of species, one after the other, is a continuous process which is a never-ending phenomenon. Climax species means never consider that it is the final stage of biodiversity which is forever. No, it is a temporary stage. When you relatively compare with our lifespan, it seems to be a climax, a stabilized biodiversity of ecosystem. So in the case of primary succession, it is a biotic succession that can occurs on a substratum like bare rock, lava sediments, sand dunes, new islands exposed out of the sea, and newly developed lakes, ponds, etc. Such substratum is quite hostile to first life or pioneer community. So it is a kind of environment where there is no life at all in primary succession. Establishing life in a bare, dead, bare rock is very difficult for the primary succession to establish themselves, which is known as a pioneer species. So this is the condition existing before the establishment of pioneer species, where you have got a bare bedrock. Secondary succession begins in a place that already has soil and was once the home of living organisms. Occurs faster and has a different pioneer species than primary succession. So what happens is, when the rate of succession is considered when relatively compared with primary succession and secondary succession, means the time being consumed for species of biodiversity to evolve and establish. In the case of primary succession, the time consumed is less when relatively compared with the primary succession. So the secondary succession rate is faster. Example is after forest fires. So when the forest fire destructs the existing species, immediately within a couple of years again the forest establishes itself. But in a bedrock place where there is no life at all, establishing species of biodiversity consumes a lot of time. That is one of the fundamental difference between primary succession and secondary succession. Secondary succession is the process that begins in an ecosystem when something has disturbed or destroyed the natural community. So, secondary succession happens when the existing primary succession has been destroyed. Secondary succession happens when soil already existing form previous ecosystems. So, when there is previous ecosystem is existing at that particular place, secondary succession happens after the destruction of the existing species or biodiversity. So, this happens because of the disaster, and again it regrowths happen. This is how secondary succession happens. The existing ecosystem is being destroyed, and later again it regrowths, leading to secondary succession. See this happens even in an aquatic ecosystem. So, when a pond is gradually being filled by sediments, when the pond is being filled, obviously what happens is this pond gradually, because of the sedimentation, transforms from an aquatic ecosystem to a terrestrial ecosystem. So, does ecological succession ever stop? Also, over long period of time, geological time scale, when you relatively compare with the geological time scale, the climate conditions and other fundamental aspects of an ecosystem changes. So, does ecological succession ever stops? So, also over long period of time, in terms of relatively comparing with the geological time scale, the climate conditions and other fundamental aspects of an ecosystem changes. So, these geological time scale changes are not observable in our ecological time, but their fundamental existence and historical reality cannot be disputed. No ecosystem then has existed or will exist unchanged or unchanging over a geological time scale. So, what is he trying to inform you is that no ecosystem is stable forever. There is a gradual change, and always a different combination of species emerge from the existing established biodiversity or ecosystem. So, it is a continuous process. So, ecological succession never stops. So, this is the succession from initial stage to the final stage. So, in this process of ecological succession, it is the resultant of the combination of certain factors. For example, autogenic succession and allogenic succession. So, what do you mean by, see this here, all these factors together lead to succession. So, for example, we need to know what is meant by autogenic succession and allogenic succession. As in the initial discussions, we have differentiated between the biotic factors of an ecosystem and abiotic factors of an ecosystem. For example, the physical factors which I have mentioned in the previous session regarding the sunlight, soil, water, air. So, these have got substantial impact on the living beings for change and succession. So, the impact of abiotic factors is known as allogenic factors which are responsible for succession. Autogenic factors means there are certain biotic factors like plants, animals, microbial organisms, and the dead leftover parts of the living beings. All these factors which are responsible for succession, which belongs to living organisms, is known as autogenic succession, when they have been influenced by, when the succession is being influenced by the biotic factors. So, in this process, the allogenic succession and autogenic succession. So, in these factors, you have got autotrophs and heterotrophs. So, autotrophic succession means autotrophs are organisms which have got the capability to synthesize their own food material, means green plants. So, from algae to the existing angiosperms, gradually, stage by stage, there is a change in the species in the ecosystem from simple to complex. So heterotroph means which cannot prepare their own food material, which depends upon autotroph. So there is both succession happening in flora and fauna in terms of biodiversity. In this process of succession of autotrophic succession and heterotrophic succession, it leads to the formation with the combination of allogenic, autogenic, heterotrophic, autotrophic. With the combination of all these factors lead to succession, establishment of pioneer stages of species. These pioneer stages in the process of succession convert into a climax stages. So in this case, species are being selected. You have got different kinds of species. For example, R selection and K selection. Through this selection in nature, succession happens. So what do you mean by R selection and what is meant by K selection can be a question. What is meant by autotrophic succession? What is meant by heterotrophic succession can be a question. What is allogenic succession? What is autotrophic succession? So in different ways questions can be framed. So depending upon the discussion being made and explanation being made, you must be able to give an answer to the question. For example, in the case of R selection and K selection, how do you differentiate this R selection and K selection by the nature in the environment? So to differentiate that, for example, you have got these R organisms which have been selected on the basis of R selection and K organisms which have got selected on the basis of K basis. Certain elements or factors which are responsible for being selected in the environment for their success. So what are these factors? So short lifespan. Some animals will have a long lifespan. So for example, take the case of mosquitoes or houseflies. Their lifespan itself is being confined to some couple of days or less than a week. Long lifespan, some animals can live for about years together, 50, 60, 70, 100 years. So that is one of the difference. Some are very small like mosquitoes and microorganisms, some are very large like elephants, some are very robust, some are very small. Some mature very fast to reproduce, some take a long time to get matured. So some have strong sex drive, weak sex drive, large number of offsprings, small number of offsprings. So these are the fundamental differences between R selection organisms and K selection organisms. So in this process, what happens is the care being taken by the parental care in K organisms is a longer duration, whereas in the case of R selection, the care being taken is less. So we have got different species in an ecosystem being selected because of R selection and K selection, where these characteristic features can exist for a species via media. So to make you understand, for example, when you draw a graph like this, the graph line which is showing green line are organisms which are being predominantly K-selected factors, on the basis of K-selected factors. So there are certain organisms which have been selected surviving in the environment based upon R-selected factors, short lifespan and number of offsprings, etc. So between these two characters, there are many number of lines can be drawn in this graph, where some will be acting in between via media based on which their survival ratio depends upon. So here R selection and K selection methods are being adopted by these succession in biodiversity is an adaptive mechanism adopted by these different organisms for better survival and succession. So after understanding this, so this is how you need to describe and understand what is autogenic and allogenic succession has been explained to you. Successions are the type of ecological succession based on the factors influencing the same. Autogenic succession is the one that is driven by biotic elements or living organisms in the specific community. Allogenic succession, on the other hand, is the ecological succession that is influenced by abiotic or external community influence. Abiotic means sunlight or water temperature, these are all abiotic factors, soil. So in the same way, the case selection species are species that reduce the number of offsprings produced in order to increase the quality of offspring production. So when you have less number of children, you can use all the resources for them. So the quality increases, the survival rate increases. This is in contrast to R selection species or species that produce a large number of offsprings to a low quality. When you have more number of offsprings, here the plan is there is the probability of selection of you will be more when you have more number of offsprings. That is the criteria here involved. So based upon these two factors of K selection and R selection, succession happens in an ecosystem. So in this process of succession, after discussing what is primary succession and secondary succession, the existing ecosystem is a resultant of action of both primary succession and secondary succession considering together. Ecological succession, ES means ecological succession, is replacement of simple species by more adapted and complex species till climax is reached. So observed process of change in the species structure of ecological community over time. So there is change in the species structure. For example, take the case of the previous geological eras, take the case of Carboniferous period. So there is a dominance of different species of firms, reptiles like dinosaurs, etc. have dominated. But right now when we compare here, the angiosperms have dominated, the mammals have dominated, and the arthropods have dominated right now. So the type of species over a period of time which has dominated the geological era is not the same always, which are changing over a period of time. The species combination in an ecosystem over a period of time is gradually changing stage by stage. The change of species from piney to climax is called ecological succession. So what is ecological succession? There is a gradual change of species combination of an ecosystem from piney to climax. So in this context, what is a community? Community consists of different species of living organisms living together, influencing one another in an ecosystem. So you have got certain plants, certain animals. You are releasing carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is being absorbed by plants. So you are influencing the plants. Plants release oxygen and you are inhaling oxygen. So without oxygen, you cannot survive. So plants are producing certain amount of food and they are releasing oxygen. So there is an influencing of one species with the another species. So when you are in an ecosystem in a process where influencing one another is known as a community. For example, you have got rhizobium bacteria, Azotobacter bacteria in the soil, which is responsible for fixing the atmospheric nitrogen with which more amount of food is being generated by the plants. So even the microorganisms are part of your community. There is a huge probiotic bacteria living in your digestive systems, which are essential for synthesizing certain vitamins. So microorganisms, plants, animals together form a community influencing one another. So in this context, we need to know what is microsuccession or cyrule. Succession of microorganisms like fungi, bacteria, etc. occur within a microhabitat is known as microsuccession. So it is not only the macroscopic organisms like plants and animals are the resultant of succession. The microorganisms like any bacteria or viruses which are living right now are also the resultant of succession, which is also being described as cyrule, known as microsuccession or cyrule. This type of succession occur with communities. For example, in dead tree, animal droppings, etc., there are certain microorganisms existing. Microbial communities may also change due to products secreted by bacteria present. So what happens is gradually even the microorganisms gradually evolve and change, which is known as cyrule. Change of pH in a habitat could provide ideal conditions for a new species to inhabit the area. So even the level of pH, the potency of hydrogen ion generation by some substance in the environment also impacts the survival of a species. At a certain pH, certain organisms survive better. So when there is more acidity increasing because of acid rain rather than the bacteria, fungi survive better. So even the pH is responsible for changing the ecological succession. In some cases, the new species may outcompete the present ones for nutrients, leading to the primary species demise. Changes can also occur by microbial succession, which variation in water availability and temperature. So with the variation of water availability, certain species or plants may not be able to survive. Certain species like xerophytes may be able to success better with the change in temperature conditions, but the change in water conditions may also impact the succession. So serial ecological succession of microorganisms like fungi, bacteria is also known as serial. Pioneer species, the species of organisms which had occupied a territory, established themselves for the first time when there is no pre-existing life forms, is known as pioneer species. In this condition, the biodiversity is few in number. Climax species, they are in harmony with the environment, both influencing each other, adopt continuously with wide diversity, well-drained spatial structure and complex food web. So in this process, in the climax community, we observe a kind of a condition here. The food web is so complex. In the initial stage, the species are less. So more or less a kind of food chain kind of thing exists in trophic levels. But with the change to climax species, the biodiversity increases, because of which the kind of trophic levels is made up of different variant kind of species with biodiversity of flora and fauna, making the ecosystem more complex, because of which the stability of the ecosystem increases, is a characteristic features of a climax community. The process of primary autotrophic succession completes through a number of sequential stages. So this succession has got certain stages. So what are the different stages through which this succession happens? One is nudation. Nudation is the first stage where there is no species at all, or there is no life at all, which is known as nudation with just bare bedrock. After this, invasion happens. The species, certain plants, microbes, animals establish themselves through migration or through the creation of life, establish themselves, reproduce themselves, and establish themselves and aggregate themselves through the process of reproduction, is known as occupying the territory, is known as invasion, is the second stage. Third stage is competition and coaction. There will be a competition existing between the increasing in the population. In this process, the organisms which compete and success will be able to establish themselves. So with the increasing in the population, there will be a competition for resources between the species happens, is the third stage. Fourth stage is a reaction. So with this competition, after being selected, there will be a reaction. Environment modifies under the influence of living organisms and vice versa. In this process of reaction, organisms modify the environment and environment modifies the organisms, is the fourth stage. Next is stabilization. Establishment of climax communities. Final terminal or climax communities becomes more or less established with equilibrium, but indeed it is temporary. So what happens is, after this reaction, interaction, competition, establishment, there will be a final establishment of species, which is being described as climax communities. So this is how, but one thing you need to remember, this is not a permanent stage, because succession is continuous, even different variant types of species re-establish again, establishing themselves in the future condition. So friends, in the next topic, we shall meet again with discussing another issue in environment. Thank you.